I'm Jeannie Rosner. I am the founder of Soul Food Salon. And essentially, we started about 7 years ago and with the mission of educating and empowering us all to be healthier. So we generally hold events, health and wellness events once a month, featuring a different expert in the health and wellness arena, whether they be an MD, PhD, an RD, a chef, etc., and a variety of topics. So the goal is to kind of tap into whatever is current and to educate all of us in our quest to be healthier. I'm very active on social media, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Everything is at Soul Food Salon. And I have a website, soulfoodsalon.com, where everything that we've done in the past, every event that we've hosted, every article that we've put out is there. So you can access that and see everything that we've been about. This event is being recorded. Many events have been recorded, and that will be up on my YouTube channel. Again, it's at Soul Food Salon, so you can subscribe to the YouTube channel if you want. And on my website, I will have a link also to this event's recording, as well as the presentations, the PowerPoint presentations from Brenda and Reshma. So every year we partner with a different nonprofit. And this year, Soul Food Salon is partnered with Off Their Plate. And Off Their Plate is a 100% volunteer-run nonprofit that was started by a third-year medical student at Harvard Medical School. And it was started in March when COVID was just starting. And this medical student saw a huge need in her immediate community. The healthcare workers in the hospitals in Boston were not being fed, essentially. The cafeterias were closed. And she also saw that the restaurants in her area were either closing or closed. And so what she did was she married the two together, where the restaurants provided meals for the healthcare workers. And it was a win-win for everybody. And now they are present in 9 major cities. They happen to be present here in the Bay Area. And so that's the nonprofit that we are working with this year. Essentially, a $100 donation feeds 10 at-need people and also provides 3 shift hours for the restaurant workers. So if you feel so inclined, which I would love for you to make a donation, it's pretty easy. You can go to my website, soulfoodsalon.com, and on the About page, which is the main page, in the middle of it is a little blurb about Off Their Plate with a video and a specific link that was created solely for Soul Food Salon for us to make donations. So far, and I'm so grateful for everybody that's made a donation, we've raised about $4,000 for Off Their Plate, which is phenomenal. However, they are really struggling to stay afloat. And one thing I failed to mention is initially they were helping healthcare workers to be fed, but now they're helping the at-need community. So please help me out with this and make a donation. So our next event is on November 19th. And it's with a wonderful woman named Shauna Shapiro. She has a PhD in psychology, and she's written a book called Good Morning, I Love You. And her topic is called The Power of Mindfulness and Compassion. So I will send out an email with that salon information, as well as a link to register. You can also, as soon as this event is over, I will update my website, and there will be a link there that you could register right from my website for the Zoom webinar. However, I will send the email out to those that are on my email list. And if you're not on it already, you can go onto my website, soulfoodsalon.com, and a pop-up will occur. And that will ask you for your information for Soulful Insights newsletter, which is basically our health and wellness newsletter that we put out a couple times a month. But that has now become my master email list. So you can go again to my website and sign up to receive the health and wellness newsletters, as well as to then receive emails for upcoming salons. So today's event, so historically we've been doing events in person. However, since COVID has arrived, we've been doing these events virtually. So today's event, Reshma will first speak, and then Brenda will speak, and they will present their presentations as well. And then I will come back on and we will do time for Q&A. So during the event, if you have any questions, please just type them into the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to address all the questions that we can. So today I have the pleasure to introduce Reshma and Brenda. So Reshma, this is going to be her third Soul Food Salon presentation for me, and she's just a wealth of knowledge. She's become a great friend of mine. We are together on this health and wellness journey. So she is a board certified pediatrician, and she has a strong interest in family health and wellness with a big focus on plant-based nutrition. And then Brenda Davis is a registered dietitian. She's a leader in her field and an internationally acclaimed speaker. She's a prolific nutrition and health writer. So together, Reshma and Brenda have written a book that is coming out at the beginning of November. You can actually pre-order it through links from my website and from their websites. And the book is called Nourish, the definitive plant-based nutrition guide for families. So feel free to pre-order for them. And so we're going to start with Reshma. I'm going to mute myself and take myself off video.
Hello. Okay. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. All right. Well, first, I just want to thank Jeannie for inviting us to come and talk. I feel like this is a celebration of our book, and I feel really fortunate to be here. I'm going to begin just by sharing, I'm just going to screen share so we can look at the presentation that I have together. Okay, so we are going to talk today about nourishing your family with a plant-based diet. And as Jeannie mentioned, we have a book that's coming out in November, and this is really the foundation for what we're going to talk about today. We have 4 broad areas that we cover in the book, including the first section is consideration, which is essentially the why of plant-based diets. We go over the health, environmental, and ethical considerations of our food choices. The second section, care, discusses all the nutrition specifics that parents are wanting to know about. The third section, confidence, talks about issues at and around the dinner table, from picky eaters to pediatric weight-related issues and the importance of family dinners. And then the final section, connection, is about resources and recipes for families. Now, obviously, we're not going to have time to cover all of these topics in great detail, but we wanted to sort of give you a tasting menu and cover some of the major topics. So we're going to start out by, I'm going to discuss the benefits of a plant-based diet and some issues around safety and adequacy, specifically for children. And then Brenda's going to talk about some of the concerns that people have when it comes to plant-based diets. When I work with the residents and medical students at Stanford and talking to them about nutrition, I always emphasize that nutrition is a really personal topic. I think when you ask a family about how they eat, you're asking them a lot of personal, intimate questions. And so I always think it's fair to share my story around food. So growing up, I grew up in a fairly traditional Indian household, and we ate vegetarian meals, ate as a family nearly every night. And my mom really cooked with simple, whole ingredients. And so we didn't really call it at the time, but essentially we were eating a plant-based diet. But as I got older, a lot of outside influences took over in terms of my food choices. So things like pizza and hamburgers and hot dogs made an increasing appearance in my diet. And I think that many of you can relate in talking to your own physicians that our nutrition education in medical school and residency training is very limited and quite inadequate. The bulk of my education around nutrition focused on these complex biochemical pathways and feeding babies through IV tubing. And for me personally, the shift began to happen when I had children of my own, because I realized at that moment that I was directly responsible for the growth and well-being of these 2 small humans. And that's when I really began to become much more interested in nutrition. And this growing awareness followed me into my exam rooms and really changed the way that I spoke to patients and families about food. So I wanted to begin just by sort of defining what we mean by a plant-based diet, because some of you may not have heard of this term before. In its simplest form, a plant-based diet is essentially a diet that aims to maximize the consumption of nutrient-dense plant foods while minimizing heavily processed and animal-based foods. So it encourages the intake of a lot of vegetables, fruits, whole grains, lentils, beans, seeds, and nuts. And Brenda and I, throughout the book and throughout this talk, you'll actually find that we use the term plant-based instead of vegan, because I think it can be a much more accessible way to talk about some of these issues. I think when people think about a vegan diet, it can seem like it's not something that's attainable or accessible for them. But a plant-based diet, as long as you're looking to maximize these plant foods, you can call yourself a plant-based eater. So there are three core benefits of a plant-based diet. A plant-based diet is a healthy, sustainable, and humane way of eating. And we're going to touch briefly on each of these topics. In terms of the health advantages associated with plant-based diets have been shown to have improved outcomes in terms of mortality and longevity. People eating a plant-based diet have a reduced risk of heart disease, as well as certain types of cancer, and a reduced risk of getting type 2 diabetes. We know that nutrition is intimately connected to health. In fact, it's estimated that 80% of heart attacks, 90% of type 2 diabetes, 70% of colorectal cancer, and a whole host of other disorders and conditions such as stroke, osteoporosis, constipation, dementia, and so much more are related to diet. When we're looking to answer the question of what diet is best for health, we can learn a lot from the blue zones. And for those of you who may not know what the blue zones are these geographical pockets located throughout the world where they have the highest concentration of centenarians. So these are communities in which people are living to age 100 and beyond, and not living to age 100 in a nursing home, but really being involved in their communities, living at home, tending to their gardens. And these 5 geographical hotspots are in Okinawa, Japan, in Icaria, Greece, Sardinia, Italy, the Nicoya Peninsula of Costa Rica, and right here in California, in Loma Linda, amongst the Seventh-day Adventists. And when researchers wanted to look at what the secret sauce was, why did these communities enjoy such vibrant health, they found that there was actually quite a bit of overlap in terms of the characteristics that define these communities. And what they found was that these communities all had a strong focus on family. They had low rates of smoking and excessive alcohol intake. They tended to lead physically active lives, were engaged in their communities. And when it came specifically to diet, they all followed a plant-centered or plant-based diet, and all of these communities ate legumes as a staple in their diet. In fact, many of the leading causes of death in the United States are actually preventable and directly related to what we eat. There was a study that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association a few years ago in which they wanted to look at the relationship between animal protein intake and all-cause mortality. And what the researchers found was that high animal protein intake, especially for people who had one lifestyle risk factor such as hypertension or elevated cholesterol, was associated with increased mortality, and that plant-based diets were actually protective. The leading cause of death in the United States is heart disease. 1 in 4 Americans will die of heart disease, and plant-based diets have been shown to be protective against heart disease. 2 long prospective studies, the EPIC Oxford study in Europe and the Adventist Health study amongst the Seventh-day Adventists, as I mentioned, in Loma Linda, both showed a protective effect of plant-based diets when it came to heart disease. And you might think as a pediatrician that heart disease might be something that I'm not overly concerned about, but what we know from autopsy studies is that atherosclerosis actually begins early in life. In fact, we can see fatty streaks in the aorta of children as young as 3 years of age. By age 10, nearly all children have evidence of these fatty streaks. And by the time we're in our 20s, we're seeing these fatty streaks develop even within our coronary arteries. So true heart disease prevention begins in childhood. When it comes to cancer, the World Cancer Research Fund put together a recommendation guideline in terms of cancer prevention. And some of the usual players that you might consider, like, limiting tobacco, not consuming a lot of sugar sweetened beverages, not consuming excessive alcohol, all of these things can be protective in terms of our risk of developing cancer. When it comes specifically to diet, what this report summarized was that a healthy diet and lifestyle behaviors could prevent 40% of cancers, and that basing our diets around plant foods like vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, all of which contain fiber and other nutrients, can reduce our risk of cancer. There was a report put out by the International Agency for Cancer Research, which is the cancer research agency for the World Health Organization, a few years ago, and they wanted to look at the relationship between red and processed meats and cancer. And what this expert panel concluded is that red meat, which would include things like bacon, deli meats, sausages, were classified as a group 1 carcinogen, which would put it in the same category as asbestos and tobacco. And that red meat is a probable carcinogen, putting it in the same category as DDT and glyphosate. So at a bare minimum, we should be looking to minimize, if not eliminate, these foods in our diet. When we look at the trends in diabetes, we know that since the mid-1990s, there's been a sharp rise in our rates of type 2 diabetes in the United States. Currently, 9.3% of Americans have type 2 diabetes, and experts estimate that if the current trends continue, that by the year 2050, 1 in every 3 Americans will have type 2 diabetes. And by the end of this talk, we're going to end up sounding like a broken record because, as you guessed, plant-based diets can be protective in terms of our risk of developing type 2 diabetes. In this large study, again, amongst the Seventh-day Adventists, they found that those people following a vegan diet had a 60% risk reduction in terms of developing type 2 diabetes. And we know that diabetes is also something just like heart disease, which can affect children. You know, when I was in training, we used to call it adult onset diabetes, and the nomenclature had to be changed because increasingly we're seeing this diagnosis in children. It's being diagnosed in children as young as 8 years of age. And the real devastating thing about type 2 diabetes in children is that they end up having these complications early on in life. So things like blindness, kidney damage, vascular damage, instead of happening in the 5th, 6th, and 7th decades of life, they're going to begin happening earlier if the diagnosis is made in childhood. Certain risk factors have been identified for diabetes in children, including obesity, having a mother with gestational diabetes, and certain ethnic groups. And some studies have suggested that breastfeeding can be protective. As the rates in type 2 diabetes have climbed, it's been strongly correlated with the increasing rates of obesity in our country and throughout the world. And again, vegetarian and vegan diets, plant-based diets, have been shown to be protective in terms of our risk of developing diabetes. In this particular study, there was a stepwise reduction in the average BMI the more plant-based you went, with vegans having the only BMI that fell within the average range. And with childhood obesity, again, the trends are increasing. Since the 1970s, in the last 4 decades, we've seen a 300% increase in the rates of obesity in children. If a child is obese at age 6, it's more likely than not that they will remain obese. 70 to 80% of adolescents that are obese will remain obese into adulthood. And the statistic that I found to be particularly alarming was that being overweight in youth predicted adult disease regardless of adult body weight. And so if we can foster diets in our children that will be protective against developing obesity and diabetes, it will serve them in the long run. I think one of the reasons that healthcare providers and even parents are confused about nutrition and its role in health is that it seems that every day there's a new headline that attempts to confuse us. You know, one minute they're talking about paleo being the best diet, and the next minute it's keto. And I think it leaves people, including healthcare professionals, confused about knowing what diet to recommend when it comes to optimizing health. But when you look at the overwhelming consensus between broad dietetic, medical, research, and public health organizations, you actually find that there's actually quite a bit of consensus. From the Harvard School of Public Health to the World Health Organization, the American Heart Association, and the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, there is strong, uniform consensus on the pillars that define a healthy diet. And what these organizations tell us is that we should be limiting our consumption of certain foods, such as trans fats, refined carbohydrates, saturated fat, cholesterol, and red and processed meats. So if these are the things that we should be aiming to reduce on our diet, what is it that we should be eating? And again, these leading organizations tell us, surprise, surprise, that we should be trying to maximize our consumption of whole plant foods like vegetables, fruits, whole grains, nuts, seeds, legumes. And I want to end the health section by sharing a quote from a recent paper by David Katz, who was generous enough to write a beautiful foreword for our book. And he says that the evidence is strong, consistent, and compelling that a diet of predominantly or even exclusively whole plant foods can promote health, selectively treat and reverse disease, and confer comparable benefit to the planet. What we should be eating then for disease reversal and health promotion for the sake of people and planet alike is clear enough. Welcome by some, clearly inconvenient to others, the truth is that we should all be eating plant-predominant diets. The what of future eating is not in question. The questions are all about how we get there from here. And this segues perfectly into my next section. So I hope I've shown you that food is very intimately connected to health, but increasingly we're seeing that food is also intimately connected to the health of our planet. Animal agriculture takes an enormous impact on our environment. 51% of all greenhouse gases come from animal agriculture, which is more than all of transportation. Animal agriculture is the leading cause of rainforest destruction, species extinction, ocean dead zones, and water pollution. It's responsible for 91% of the destruction of the Amazon, and it occupies 45% of the Earth's ice-free landmass. When we look at water usage, the meat and dairy industry use up a third of our Earth's fresh water supply. It takes about 2 football fields worth of land to feed one person the standard American diet. And these same 2 football fields could feed 14 people eating a plant-based diet. When we look at the use of resource in the United States, it's estimated that 80% of all antibiotics go to animal agriculture. Additionally, 50% of the world's grains go towards feeding livestock, and this is happening at the same time that nearly 1 billion people are going hungry each and every day. In fact, some experts estimate that if we diverted these grains and feeds towards feeding humans, that we could largely solve the problem of world hunger. And we're seeing these environmental concerns echoed in our dietary recommendations. So earlier this year, Canada came out with a new food guide. And if you look at their plate, it's predominantly plant-based. There is very little animal protein, and they actually encourage people to emphasize plant sources of protein over animal sources of protein. One of the remarkable things about this guide is that they took dairy completely off the plate, which, was quite stunning. I think the dairy is still on our plates and recommendations. There was a report published called the Eat Lancet Commission on Food, Planet, and Health, and they gathered together experts from a variety of fields, from health and environment and sustainability issues. And the expert panel wanted to answer the question of, can we feed a future population of 10 billion people a healthy diet within planetary boundaries? And the conclusions from this report were that food is the single strongest lever to optimize human health and environmental sustainability on Earth. A diet rich in plant foods and with fewer animal source foods confers both improved health and environmental outcomes. And when I first started to look at some of the environmental impacts of our food choices, frankly, I felt very overwhelmed. I felt, what could I as one person, or even we as one family, do to really have an impact on the environment? And what I slowly began to realize is that small changes practiced on a wide scale can have enormous impact. So something as simple as cutting back on our animal product consumption by 15%, which would be the equivalent of everyone just doing Meatless Monday, would be the equivalent of taking 240 million cars off the road each and every year. There's a wonderful book for those of you who are interested that I highly recommend by Jonathan Safran Foer called We Are the Weather, Saving the Planet Begins at Breakfast. And I love this quote that he shares in the book. He says, changing how we eat will not be enough on its own to save the planet, but we cannot save the planet without changing how we eat. And this brings me to my last consideration in terms of the benefits of a plant-based diet. And it's for the animals. And I know that Brenda's here, and I'm sure it's a little awkward for her that I'm quoting her while she's here, but I love this quote that Brenda shares in one of her books that was a tremendous resource for me as I was beginning this journey, called Becoming Vegan. And Brenda says that being vegan isn't about personal purity or about moral superiority. It's about making a conscious choice to widen your circle of compassion by avoiding animal exploitation as far as is possible and practical. And in fact, most Americans agree. There was a poll conducted by the ASPCA a few years ago in which they found that 94% of Americans agree that animals should not suffer. And this is incongruent with the fact that nearly 10 billion farm animals are raised and slaughtered for food each and every year in the United States. And 99% of these animals come from factory farms. And I'll end this section with a quote from Albert Einstein, who says that vegetarian food leaves a deep impression on our nature. If the whole world adopts vegetarianism, it can change the destiny of humankind. And the last little section I want to talk about before I hand it over to Brenda is this core question that we often get asked by parents. Are plant-based diets safe for infants and children? Because at the end of the day, no matter how healthy it may be, no matter how much it may protect our environment, if it's not safe and adequate for growing children, it really doesn't serve parents. To answer this question, we can look at a position paper that was published by the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics a few years ago. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics is the leading dietetic organization in the world. And in their position statement, they unequivocally state that it is the position of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics that appropriately planned vegetarian diets, including total vegetarian or vegan diets, are healthful, nutritionally adequate, and may provide health benefits in the prevention and treatment of certain diseases. Well-planned vegetarian diets are appropriate for individuals during all stages of the life cycle, including pregnancy, lactation, infancy, childhood, adolescence, and for athletes. And I think the place where most parents and even healthcare providers get caught up are on the words appropriately planned and well planned, because what does that even mean? And are we capable as busy parents to provide our children with such exquisitely planned diets? And Brenda and I would argue that actually all diets for children need to be well planned. So when our children are served a school lunch that looks like this, we don't really worry too much about whether or not it's meeting their nutritional needs. But somehow, if we wanted to swap it out with a lunch that looked like this, we become very concerned that they're not going to be able to meet their nutritional needs. Numerous studies have shown that plant-based diets, from lacto-ovo-vegetarian to complete vegan diets, have been safe for children. These children grow just as well as omnivorous children, and the studies back that up. The one area that sometimes children's growth can be a little bit slower compared to omnivorous children is during the toddler years, when they're weaning off of breast milk or formula. And as long as children are provided with adequate calories during this stage, they can absolutely meet their growth and developmental milestones. We've all heard these concerning stories about an infant or a child that's suffering a deficiency and has catastrophic outcomes, from developmental delay to even death. And most prominently, these are with B12 deficiency. But it's important to emphasize that oftentimes these children were fed highly restrictive diets that would not be appropriate for any child. And in fact, many of the studies that looked at growth and development of vegan and vegetarian children decades ago followed communities that practice very restrictive diets, from raw food only diets. Sometimes these communities refused enriched or refined foods. They often used infant formulas that were homemade, which is not recommended and would not be adequate for growth. And sometimes these communities even refused vitamin and mineral supplementations, which brings me to my final point, which is the idea and the notion of plant-based parenting today. I think that families are much more aware of the specific nutrients that need to be considered, and Brenda will talk more in detail about that. Healthcare providers are also becoming much more comfortable advising and supporting families. There's been an increased availability of nutrient-rich and fortified foods. And the last point I want to make is that, to some degree, all of our diets are fortified. Vitamin D is added to milk in order to have, vitamin D and vitamin A are both added to milk, so it's a fortified food. So the idea that plant-based diets, because they require fortification, that somehow it makes them inadequate, is simply not true, because all of our diets are essentially fortified to some degree. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Brenda, and then I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you so much, Reshma, and thank you, Jean, for having us. We so appreciate it. I am going to be continuing on with the theme that Reshma started with, but I will be talking about some of the concerns that parents have about using or feeding their children with plant-based diets. And the most common nutrient concerns are protein, iron, zinc, calcium, vitamin D, vitamin B12, iodine, and omega-3 fatty acids. And of course, this afternoon, we don't have time to cover every single one of these nutrients, but we will focus on the four that I think I get asked about the most. So the first being protein, and the issue, of course, is, well, if you're not eating meat, where on earth are you going to get your protein? The second being calcium. If you're not drinking milk, can you get enough calcium? The third being B12, which is not present in any significant quantity in plant foods. And the last nutrient that I'll look at is omega-3s. And people wonder, if you're not feeding a child fish, how are they going to get their long-chain omega-3 fatty acids? So let's begin with protein. This cartoon is this little rodent at the corner saying, "No meat at all? Are you sure you're getting enough protein?" And he's, of course, saying this to the gorilla. And the point being that even the largest mammals on the planet manage to build huge muscles from plants. And so can we. There are many, many completely plant-based bodybuilders like Derek Tresize here. So the first question that often we have to consider when we think about our needs for protein is how much protein is actually required. And the RDA that's set by the Institute of Medicine for people in North America is 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram body weight. And of course, a kilogram is 2.2 pounds. And we need a little more than that for infants and children. And we need a little more for athletes, especially competitive athletes. We possibly need more for seniors, and for people that are eating very high fiber plant-based diets, we might want to add 10%, bringing it up to 0.9 grams per kilogram body weight. And the reason that we might need a little bit more for plant-based eaters is simply because of the protein digestibility. It is actually reduced by fiber in plant cell walls. So if you're eating plants where you've removed a lot of the fiber, the protein digestibility is actually very comparable to what you see in animal products. So things like tofu and peanut butter and soy protein isolate or flour products with the fiber removed, you're looking somewhere 92 to 96% digestible protein, and it's about 94 to 97 in the animal products. Now you can see that in whole plant foods like oatmeal and lentils or beans, these kinds of higher fiber foods, we probably absorb somewhere in the neighborhood of about 80, 85% generally. So the things to know are that you can actually increase the digestibility of protein in these plant foods by soaking, by sprouting, by cooking, and by blending, because you're breaking down that fiber in those plant cell walls, so you make the protein a little more digestible. So average requirements for women are about 46 grams of protein a day, and for men, about 56 grams of protein a day. And that's for the average weight person. If for a person that's a larger person, you would need more. Now, this is for these numbers are based on healthy body weight. So a person who's obese would determine their protein requirements based on a healthy body weight. And if we added 10% to that to be really safe for people eating a whole food plant-based diet, we'd be looking at about 51 grams for women and about 62 for men. So what are the actual intakes among people eating very plant-based diets like vegetarians and vegans? Well, in the Adventist Health Study 2, total protein intake was about 75 grams, 74.7 for meat eaters. It was almost 71 for both vegetarians and vegans. So the difference really wasn't very significant. Now in Epic Oxford, this is in the United Kingdom, there was a larger difference. Meat eaters around the 93 grams and vegetarians were around 74 and vegans just over the 67. But you can see that regardless of whether we're looking at the Adventist Health Study or Epic Oxford, everybody is well within the recommended intakes for protein. If you look at plant protein sources, we see about 10 to 15 grams of protein in very small servings, like child-sized servings of tofu, veggie meats, soybeans, around 10 to 15 grams of protein per serving. That is very similar to a 2-ounce serving of meat. You can see significant amounts of protein in things like hemp seeds and soy milk, and of course, legumes, including lentils, which are one of the more protein concentrated of the legumes. And they fall in a very similar range to eggs and cheese and milk. And then even foods that you might not think of as huge protein sources actually contribute fairly significantly to our overall protein intakes. Things like nuts and seeds and whole grains, for example. Plant-based eaters generally get plenty of protein unless they don't get enough calories. And we may see that with people who have eating disorders like anorexia nervosa, or people who are impoverished. We don't see it a lot in North America. And secondly, people that eat nutritionally inadequate diets that are low in protein, like high fat, high sugar junk food diets, or fruitarian diets may not always contain enough protein. So the other question that often comes up is, but isn't plant protein inferior to animal protein? And the concern here is that plant protein is incomplete, or that it's missing some of the essential amino acids. And the thing that you need to know is that all plant foods contain all 9 essential amino acids, although sometimes the amounts of the 2 amino acids particularly, but mainly lysine, but also sometimes methionine, can be a little bit low in the plant. Now, if you're eating a very grain-based diet, grains are higher in methionine, then lysine can be low. But if you just add in a few legumes, then usually you get lysine to where it needs to be. So soy actually has a very similar amino acid profile to animal protein, and other legumes and many seeds are also very close to animal protein. So the big surprise is that all essential amino acids are actually made by plants. We get them either directly by eating plants, or we get them indirectly by eating animals that ate plants, or very indirectly by eating animals that ate other animals that ate plants, but they're made by plants. That's why they're essential. We can't make them. So how do we ensure sufficient amounts of all the essential amino acids on a plant-based diet? Well, we don't need to complement protein as we once believed we did back in the 80s. All we really need to do is eat a variety of plant foods over the course of the day. And we want to include lysine-rich choices like soy products, tofu, tempeh, soy milk, beans, lentils, split peas, peanuts, quinoa, pistachios, and seeds like hemp and pumpkin seeds as part of the mix. Just including a range of those foods will help to ensure that will happen. So moving on to calcium. So can we get enough calcium without dairy is a big question for a lot of parents. And so is dairy really necessary? Because of course we know cow's milk has a lot of calcium. It has about 300 milligrams of calcium per cup. Moose milk actually has about 600 milligrams of calcium per cup, and we don't consider it an essential food. In fact, the milk of other mammals, other than human mammals, is not essential for human beings. It would actually kind of defy rationality if the milk of a cat was necessary for a dog, or the milk of any species required for another species. Mammals produce milk to help with the growth of their offspring, and it's very, very specifically designed for their offspring. So in pre-agricultural populations, humans actually averaged about 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams of calcium without a single drop of cow's milk. Most of it actually came from plants. Calcium-rich plant foods offer some pretty impressive advantages over dairy. It's low in saturated fat, it's cholesterol-free, and plants are very rich sources of fiber and antioxidants and phytochemicals and a lot of vitamins that are helpful for bone health as well, like vitamin C and K and folate, and minerals that are important for bone health, not just calcium, but magnesium and potassium and boron. And so how much calcium do we need? Well, we need, for adults, about 1,000 milligrams for women under 50 and for men under 70. And once women hit 50 and men 70 or over, they need about 1,200. And then you can see about 1,300 for teens, about 1,000 for children 4 to 8 years of age, and about 700 for toddlers. So what are our actual calcium intakes like as plant-based eaters? Well, lacto-ovo vegetarians get as much calcium as non-vegetarians, as we would imagine, because they're consumers of dairy, lacto meaning dairy and ovo meaning eggs. And whereas vegans or 100% plant-based eaters actually often do fall below the RDA for calcium. Now, this is one study that was a little bit concerning because it was a large study looking at the risk of fractures in vegetarians and vegans compared to fish eaters and meat eaters. And what they found was the meat eaters, fish eaters, and lacto-ovo vegetarians all had about the same risk of fractures, but vegans in this study had a 30% higher risk. However, when they looked only at vegans who were eating at least 525 milligrams of calcium a day, the risk was identical to the meat eaters. And the issue here is that 45% of vegans actually had intakes lower than 525 milligrams a day, and 76% of the vegans had intakes under 700 milligrams a day. But I should also say that in the Adventist Health Study too, vegan intakes were over 900 milligrams a day. And so that's, you know, it's kind of interesting. The take-home message here is the bone health of vegans may be compromised when calcium intake is very low. Vegans need to be consuming at least 525 milligrams of calcium per day, but they should probably be striving to meet the RDA like the vegans in North America tend to do. And I think the difference between the North American vegans and the vegans in Epic Oxford is that in the Adventist community, people consume a lot of fortified non-dairy or dairy alternatives like soy milk and cashew milk and almond milk and so on. And they're fortified to the same degree as cow's milk. So it makes sense you would see approximately the same intake of calcium. And whereas in Epic Oxford, those fortified products I don't think are quite as well utilized. So how can we get enough calcium without dairy? Well, really two things that come into play. Number one, we need to include plenty of calcium-rich plant foods or calcium fortified foods. And we also need to be aware of some of the factors that affect calcium absorption. So when we think about calcium-rich plant foods, we're thinking about fortified foods like all of the non-dairy alternatives that I mentioned. Things like for example, the tofu that's made with calcium. You look on the label for calcium sulfate. When the tofu says nagari as the coagulating agent, that's magnesium rather than calcium. Magnesium's great too, but if you're trying to boost your calcium intake, you're going to get more calcium from tofu that's made with calcium. And then the other thing is the dark green leafy vegetables that are low in oxalates, because oxalates bind with calcium and we can't absorb the calcium from those foods. So the foods that are really high in oxalate, or the greens that are high in oxalates, are beet greens and spinach and Swiss chard. So those you can't really rely on as high calcium sources, because even though they have a lot of calcium, you just can't get the calcium out of those foods, as opposed to things like turnip greens and kale and Chinese greens and broccoli. We absorb about, actually, well, I'll show you in a second how much we absorb. So other foods that are great sources are beans like Great Northern beans and black turtle beans, and blackstrap molasses and tahini and almonds and figs are all pretty good calcium sources. And the other thing I want to mention here with calcium sources is it's actually better if you're eating calcium in little bits throughout the day than if you just had a great big bolus of, 2 cups of milk where you're getting 600 milligrams. You actually absorb more. A higher percentage of the calcium is absorbed when you eat smaller amounts over the course of the day. The other thing we can do is to select calcium fortified non-dairy milks and other foods with added calcium like the tofu. It's way easier to get 1,000 milligrams of calcium, especially for a small child, when calcium fortified foods are included. And so, calcium fortified non-dairy milks provide about 300 to 450 milligrams of calcium per cup. So 2 servings, like 2 cups, along with a few other calcium-rich choices, and you're there. Here's a child menu with 1,000 milligrams of calcium, just so you can see this is not impossible. So we've got a small serving of oatmeal with berries, a cup of the fortified non-dairy milk, a few chia seeds, a whole grain muffin as a snack, a peanut butter and banana wrap for lunch with a few veggies and dip, a smoothie, a small smoothie made with a cup of non-dairy fortified milk, and then dinner, some black beans, quinoa, and broccoli, and a chocolate pudding. And we're actually at the 1,000 milligrams. And those are really quite small servings of all of these things, or child-sized servings. We want to also be aware of factors that impact calcium absorption. So the things that have a negative impact are excessive oxalates or phytates, excessive sodium, and a high acid load. Alcohol, which isn't an issue for children, but it sure can be an issue for teenagers and adults, and caffeine as well for those demographics. The thing that has the most positive impact on calcium absorption is vitamin D. So we really need to make sure we're getting a source of vitamin D throughout the year, even in the cool winter months. So a lot of people say, well, that's great that there's calcium in plant foods, but is it actually bioavailable? Can we absorb it? And in fact, we absorb about 32% of the calcium from dairy products like milk and cheese and yogurt. We absorb about the same amount from tofu that's made with calcium. We absorb a little bit less from things like soy milk and legumes that are fairly good sources of calcium, but not a lot less. It's somewhere in the 20 to 30% range. We actually absorb about that from sweet potatoes as well, but we absorb the most calcium, about 40 to 60%, from things like the low oxalate greens I mentioned, and those are really wonderful foods. We absorb the least from the high oxalate greens. So what are other factors that affect calcium absorption? Well, the amount of calcium consumed, as I mentioned earlier, the age and life stage. So calcium absorption can be as high as 60% in infants and young children, and it gradually declines to about 15 or 20% during adulthood, except during pregnancy when our bodies need more calcium and the absorption shoots up again. And as Reshma mentioned, we no longer actually have a designated group for dairy in Canada's food guide. Now, dairy is a part of the protein-rich foods, so it has a much smaller presence than it used to have. So people eating a lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet that are including some dairy products, they would be included, or they would be counted as their protein choices. And of course, the food guide is certainly, I think it's ahead of its time in some ways, as other countries are looking to this guide to say, well, maybe this is possible to do a guide that's much more plant-based. Now, vitamin B12, how much do we need? Well, we need about a microgram for small children. It's about 0.9 for 1 to 3, 1.2 for 4 to 8, 1.8 for 9 to 13. And then for anyone 14 years plus, it's about 2.4 micrograms. Goes up a little bit in pregnancy and lactation. But the one thing I want to mention is that there are a number of studies suggesting that these numbers are probably a little bit too low. And so, for example, for 14 years plus, we seem to be able to maintain our B12 status better with about 4 to 7 micrograms. And so that, I think doubling the RDA is not a bad idea. So are plant-based eaters at higher risk? Well, the answer is absolutely. Plant foods are not reliable B12 sources unless they're fortified with B12. Even foods that we commonly think of as being sources, or many people commonly think as of being reliable sources, like organic vegetables and seaweed and fermented foods and mushrooms, even though these foods can contain small amounts, they should not be relied on as major sources of vitamin B12 because the amounts are highly variable and they're not reliable. And we do have some stores of B12 in our body and in adults, in our bodies, and in adults, they can last 2 to 3 years or even longer. But for some adults, they're gone within 6 months or a year. So it really depends on the individual. And breastfed babies born to B12 deficient mothers can develop B12 deficiency within months or even weeks of birth. And so this is something that we just absolutely cannot mess around with. And the symptoms of B12 deficiency are megaloblastic anemia. This is, like it has many of the same symptoms as iron deficiency anemia, like the fatigue and slow thinking and all of that. nerve and brain damage, gastrointestinal disturbances, and elevated homocysteine, which can increase our risk of heart disease and of birth defects as well. So we really don't want to mess with B12. Vegetarians, vegans, and anyone over the age of 50 needs to ensure reliable daily sources of B12 and to regularly monitor their B12 status. So what are reliable B12 sources? Well, of course, supplements are reliable sources, vitamin B12 fortified foods, and animal products for people under 50 years of age. So even if you're sort of a plant strong or a lacto-ovo vegetarian, milk and eggs can supply some of the B12, or fish or meat for those that include some of those foods. But for people under 50. And why under 50? Well, the Institute of Medicine actually recommends that people over 50, 50 or more, get their B12 from fortified foods or supplements like vegans would. And the reason is really very simple. B12 is bound to protein in animal foods, and aging reduces our gastric acid and our ability to produce enzymes that help to cleave the B12 off the protein it's bound to. And so as we get older, we don't do that as well. So we can't really rely on these foods as much for B12. So it's better to rely on supplements and fortified foods. So how much would we be taking if we take B12 once a day, for example? Well, it ranges from about 10 to 50 micrograms in childhood. And then for adults, I would say about 100 micrograms. For those 65 plus, they're probably better off taking 1,000 micrograms a day, and same with during pregnancy and lactation. And you might wonder why so much when the RDA is so much smaller. And in fact, it's because when you're taking a large bolus, like say, 1,000 micrograms or even 500 micrograms, you might absorb 1%. As we go towards smaller amounts, like let's say you consume 1 microgram from food, you would absorb probably about 50% of it. So the higher we get, the less our absorption. So let's move on to omega-3 fatty acids. And of course, the big question is fish necessary in the diet? And the answer is actually no. We can get omega-3 fatty acids from plants. We can get them from land plants, which provide alpha-linolenic acid, like seeds, chia, flax, and hemp seeds, and nuts like walnuts. But we can also get the long chain, and greens. And we also get the long chain omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA, from sea plants and from something called microalgae. And microalgae are tiny little algae that grow in the ocean, where the fish actually get most of their EPA and DHA by, at some point in the food chain, eating fish that ate this microalgae. And so we're actually cultivating this microalgae, growing it. And then you can get the EPA and DHA from supplements. And then the other is macroalgae. And so microalgae in supplement form, macroalgae from seaweed, but macroalgae only provides EPA, it doesn't provide DHA, whereas with the microalgae, you get both. And do plant eaters get enough omega-3s? Well, compared to non-vegetarians, we probably, are about 30% lower for lacto-ovo vegetarians and probably about 40 to 70% lower in vegans. And, are we getting enough? We don't really know whether or not the amount we're getting is optimal. We know that it's lower. And so because there's so much evidence suggesting benefits to omega-3s, it makes sense for us to try to optimize our intake. So how can people who don't eat fish optimize omega-3s? Well, first, you want to be aware of factors that depress the conversion of plant omega-3s to the long chain omega-3s that are more biologically active, the EPA and DHA. And the non-dietary factors that affect conversion negatively are, genetics and then gender. Men are less efficient converters than women. Smoking, age, and chronic diseases like diabetes and hypertension, metabolic syndrome, all can block that conversion to DHA. And then there are diet factors as well, like high intake of omega-6 fatty acids depress conversion of omega-3s inadequate nutrition, insufficient protein, lack of vitamin and mineral cofactors that are necessary for the conversion. Trans fatty acids and alcohol can also negatively affect conversion, as can very high fat diets. Diets that contain 40% of calories from fat are not nearly as efficient at converting as diets that contain 20% of calories from fat. Number two is to ensure sufficient of those plant omega-3s. So the alpha-linolenic acid, for those who don't eat fish, we usually would recommend about 2 to 4 grams of alpha-linolenic acid per day. Little less for children, but for adults, 2 to 4 per day. And so how much food do we need to get that? Well, we need about an ounce of walnuts, you get about 2.6 grams. A tablespoon of chia seeds provides about 2.5. A tablespoon of ground flax seeds, and flax seeds are slippery little seeds. If you don't grind them, they tend to go right through you, and so you wouldn't get as much omega-3. Only you would get it from the seeds you chew well, but we wouldn't always chew them all well. So grinding them is a good idea to extract the omega-3s. So we get about 1.6. So a couple tablespoons of flax would get us over the 3. A tablespoon of hemp seeds is about 1. Leafy greens are actually about half the fat is omega-3, but they're so low in fat, you'd have to eat 20 or 30 cups of them to get enough omega-3s. We want to reduce omega-6s if we're consuming a lot. So the omega-6 rich oils like safflower oil, grapeseed oil, sunflower, and corn oil are really high in omega-6s. So if you're using that liberally, it can really affect the amount of omega-6 versus omega-3, and it can depress the conversion of omega-3. Even soy, cottonseed, and sesame oil are fairly high in omega-6s. And omega-6 rich whole foods, by contrast, like pumpkin and sunflower and sesame seeds, you would enjoy in your diet and not worry so much about, restricting those. And then finally, you can consider direct sources of long chain omega-3 fatty acids. And so who needs it? We don't know for sure. But we think because in pregnancy and breastfeeding, we have certainly better conversion, but we also have a lot higher requirements that it makes sense during those times of life to be supplementing, and also those who may not be very efficient converters. So people with diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and hypertension. Populations who traditionally eat a lot of fish, like Japanese or Inuit, may not make the enzymes for conversion quite as efficiently. And what would we, and of course, anyone can possibly benefit from these kinds of supplements. I take them myself. I think Reshma takes them as well. And so there are a lot of choices. Dr. Furman has, there are probably a dozen different varieties available on the market. And generally what we would recommend is 200 or 300 milligrams a day. And some people may need a little bit more, depending on the situation. And of course, there are lots of advantages of the plant options over fish. The plant options are cultured, so they're clean. I mean, fish is only as clean as the water it's swimming in. They're sustainable and they're cruelty-free. There are lots of problems with fish in terms of contamination with heavy metals, environmental contaminants like PCBs, DDT, malachite green, and antibiotics, antiseptics, and there are ecological concerns. Some folks estimate that by 2050, our fish stocks in the oceans will be pretty much depleted. And there are ethical concerns. When we catch shrimp, for example, 80% of what we catch is bycatch that gets thrown back into the ocean dead. So there are lots of problems. So finishing up, I just want to say well-designed whole food plant-based diets are nutritionally adequate and can provide very powerful protection against chronic disease. But as we know, there are many benefits, as Reshma mentioned, beyond ourselves. These diets are ecologically sustainable, ethically justifiable. So by getting our nutrition from plants, we really all win. And when we consider the consequences of our food choices, not just for ourselves, but really beyond ourselves, a plant-based diet really becomes both an ecological and an ethical imperative. And with that, I will, and just a reminder about the book that's coming out, and I will open the floor to questions. So I will stop my share.
All right. Oh my God. So awesome. Really so awesome. Thank you. Thank you both. Many questions have come in. I have many questions. So let's see what we can get through here. I guess the first question that I have is, how did the collaboration between the two of you actually evolve? I think you met on an airplane maybe, or at a conference?
I'll let Reshma take that.
It's, I feel like it's like a when we met story. I think of it fondly. So several years ago, I was flying from SFO down to Anaheim for the annual plant-based nutrition conference. And I just happened to be sitting next to Brenda on the plane. And I, of course, knew exactly who she was, because Becoming Vegan is like, you know, one of my standard books that I've been relying on. And I nearly peed my pants because Brenda Davis was sitting next to me. And so we ended up chatting the whole plane ride down. And, you know, after the conference, we just stayed in touch. And the following year, we met again at the same conference. And the last day of the conference, I remember sitting next to Brenda at breakfast, and I was asking for, you know, just some professional guidance and mentorship, and wondering how, I mean, for those of you who don't know Brenda, she is like a pioneer in the plant-based community. She really is one of the original like plant-based gurus. So I was just asking her for some professional advice. And, you know, when I asked her, like, I wouldn't even know where to begin in terms of writing a book, she said that we could do it together. And when I got on the airplane, I started drafting the notes for our book. So that's kind of how we met.
And you know what, I just want to add that I can't imagine writing a book with a more wonderful partner. Reshma has all the skills I don't have. And so in terms of all of the social media and just putting things together, and just, I mean, and she's an absolutely brilliant writer. I feel like I just lucked out big time.
That's awesome. So a couple questions. One question has come from an athlete in the crowd, and she was wondering how you recommend that athletes go about making the shift to a more plant-based diet.
I can take that. I think that they need to really learn about the plant-based nutrition. And so there are a lot of resources out there. There, you know, depending on what type of sports you do. One of my closest friends is actually a world champion mountain biker. Her name is Sonia Looney, and I can never forget when she first told me her story. She said, I was so scared when I went from being an omnivorous athlete, because I was in the top 20 in the world, and I was so scared that it would set me back going plant-based. And she said, within 6 months of going plant-based, I won the world championships. I was number one. And she said, what happened to her is her recovery was so much better eating plant-based than it was eating an omnivorous diet. And so she did a lot of, you know, fine tuning and trying different things, but you know, you want to make sure you're getting enough protein, you're getting enough calcium. And so having a good guidebook for athletes, I mean, even in Becoming Vegan, we have a whole big chapter on athletes that guides step by step how to put together a diet that works. And some athletes need 5,000 calories a day. Getting enough protein when you're eating 5,000 calories a day is a breeze. It's, you know, your intakes of all nutrients are huge. So for athletes that aren't consuming as many calories, it can be a little more challenging, but I tell you, it is so much more challenging when you've got a senior trying to get, you know, the higher protein intakes when their calorie intakes are so low than it is for an athlete. Athletes, you know, and you know, I got to tell you, I do a smoothie for my husband every day. I prefer to eat the solid foods because I love eating so much, but he doesn't care about eating so much. He just wants to drink it down. I make a smoothie that has no protein powder, that has between 35 and 40 grams of protein. It's one Vitamix container full. It's 3/4 greens. And then I add a few veggies, like a carrot. I add some celery and some cucumber. And then I add a cup of frozen peas. I add about 1/4 cup of hemp seeds. and I add soy milk, probably about 3 cups, and it is loaded with protein.
So
And
there's
so
no
you can,
sweet, there's no nothing sweet in that though.
oh no, I do put in, I have to say, I do put in a few pieces of banana or pineapple or, you know, some slices of apple. I do put a little bit, but not a lot. So our palates are, you know, pretty geared to eating low sweet. So he loves it.
Great. So I know you had mentioned just to educate the audience about grinding the flax seeds. So I personally have like a separate coffee grinder. You grind them and you can leave them in the refrigerator for a little while. So it's as opposed to eating them whole.
Yeah, and so the way I do it actually, Jean, is I do it in a blender, and I do about 2 or 3 cups at the time. And so I just grind a whole bunch. It takes 2 seconds. They're done. And it's very simple. And I have mason jars in my freezer. I have one of those bottom freezers that you pull out. And that bottom freezer is just all glass mason jars with labels, and it's all nuts and seeds. And that's where I keep my nuts and seeds. And I have ground flax, I have regular flax, and I have my chia and my hemp and my, you know, pumpkin seeds and sunflower seeds and all the different kinds of nuts. And that's where they stay, because nuts and seeds are actually the fats in them are, you know, once you've taken off their protection, so you've removed their shell, they're more prone to rancidity, especially those that are high in omega-3s, like chia, flax, hemp, and walnuts. And they're best stored in the refrigerator or freezer. And so to really preserve the nutrients, that, you know, it just works really well.
Great. So I have a question. If you are eating predominantly whole food, plant-based diet, and you're trying to avoid processed food, which I think any fortification of a food is somewhat processed, right? How do you fortify your diet that way? Like, this is a question. I mean,
yeah, it's really simple. You take a supplement. So if you don't want to use fortified foods at all, but you need obviously to get a source of B12, you need to take a B12 supplement, period. That's what you have to do. And you know, if you think about it, as Reshma mentioned, you know, with omnivorous diets, we add iodine to the salt, we add vitamin D to the milk, you know, we're adding iron to a number of foods as well. So we fortify foods with folic acid, we add B vitamins to most of our flours. There's all kinds of nutrients added. But if you're really opposed to that, then you need to eat a really, really good diet and take the supplements for the nutrients you absolutely can't get. So B12 is the main one, but vitamin D is another one. And iodine is, if you're not, a lot of people that don't want to use don't want to use fortified foods, don't want to use iodized salt either, then you need to be having some seaweed or something that's going to be providing your iodine.
okay, great. Someone had asked if the charts from this presentation are in your book. You all can
Those
answer.
and so many more. I mean, the book has lots and lots of charts. So I don't know that those specific charts exactly are in the book. We did share the slides, but Brenda composed so many beautiful charts. I mean, we only touched on a few of the nutrients, but all the nutrients that we cover have detailed charts.
Okay. The charts that were on this presentation will be on my website, and you guys will have access to this presentation just going to the website. So I have a question. Brenda, you had talked about the microalgae supplements, that the recommendation is 200 to 300 milligrams. And however, isn't the recommendation for omega-3 supplementation roughly about 2 grams? So is there?
Oh yes. No, the recommendation for omega-3s from the Institute of Medicine is actually for alpha-linolenic acid, because it's the only omega-3 that's considered essential, because technically our bodies convert that to the long chain omega-3. So the recommendation is 1.1 grams for men, or for women, and 1.6 for men. I suggest people eating plant-based who don't eat fish double that, to make sure they've got enough of that precursor to make the long chain. But then there's a bunch of people who may not convert well enough, as I mentioned. For those people, and possibly for others as well, it makes sense to include a preformed omega-3. Now that 2 grams is a recommendation that is for people with heart disease. They're taking the omega-3s to lower their triglyceride levels. Almost all of the international organizations that actually have a recommendation or a suggestion for how much omega-3 you might want, it's usually around the 3 to 500 milligrams. And so the 2 to 300. So think of this. This is a simple way to think about it. Most of the organizations recommend fish twice a week. In a serving of fish, you might get, depending on the type of fish, but if it's a high omega-3 fish like salmon, you might get 1,000. If you're getting a little bit lower omega-3 fish, you might get 500. You're doing that twice a week, and that's considered enough for the average person.
All right, gotcha. So you had mentioned some of the foods where calcium absorption is diminished. So when you say the recommendation for people that are like 50 and greater is about 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams, should they actually be taking in more? Should you factor in more in your diet?
Yeah, no. That number, it actually is assuming that your digestion is less. So
Okay.
those numbers by the Institute of Medicine have factored, it's just your number as you're looking at the late food label, you're striving for 1,000 or 1,200. They've done all that math for you. That's
Okay.
all you need to worry about.
Okay, great. All right, let me see if there's a couple other questions here. Sorry.
No problem.
So someone had asked about the omega-3 algae supplements. The dose that you recommended, I think, was 200 to 300 milligrams per day. Nordic Naturals, the brand Nordic Naturals, they suggest 2 pills per day, which is 715 milligrams.
Okay, so I'm going to tell you, it really depends on the individual. So I've seen people trying to get their omega-3 index higher, and they were not able to do it if they didn't take 800 milligrams a day. So it's, the way that we, came up with that 200 to 300 a day, and maybe you just want to do 1,000 twice a week, is really based on the recommendation for fish eaters of eating fish twice a week and trying to come up in that same territory. We, to be honest with you, our knowledge of omega-3s at this point in time is still such that we don't know what the exact best number would be. And I can guarantee you it won't be the same for you as it is for me, because we all have different production of conversion enzymes. We all have slightly different diets that affect our conversion in different ways. And so if we're taking the preformed, that helps. We don't have to worry as much about conversion, but we still don't know what is ideal in terms of, the amount each person would need to have a really good omega-3 index, for example. So it's a little bit of a crapshoot still. And I mean, ideally, if people could know their levels and all of that, but that gets really tricky and expensive. So for most people, having that 200 or 300 milligrams a day is probably a reasonable, place to be if they're concerned about their, conversion.
And then do you have any thoughts on flax oil?
Yeah, so my thoughts on flax oil is that if you are using it, you use it in salads. You definitely don't ever use it in anything you're cooking, because flaxseed oil has a very low smoke point. And so it's just a culinary oil to be used in a little bit of salad dressing. So certainly you get alpha linolenic acid from that. You get no DHA or EPA. So you don't get those biologically active long chain fatty acids. Your body needs to convert. And so that, and definitely people that are eating a lot of flax oil, sometimes their ALA levels can even get too high. So you need to be a little bit cautious with that. You don't want to go too high or be having too much. So a teaspoon in a salad dressing is probably a reasonable amount for an average person.
Okay. How about soy? Like, I know like, what is it? 90% of soy products are genetically modified. So I imagine you recommend using organic.
Yeah, I think, Brenda and I talk about this in more detail in the book, but I think it always comes to a balance in terms of what your resources are. So with soy foods and even with fruits and vegetables, if you can choose organic, and I know you've mentioned the environmental working group many times at the Soul Food Salons, but that's a great reference point. But for soy in particular, we do recommend organic if you're able to.
And then, but what about, like I use soy milk in my coffee and it's totally unsweetened. It's basically water and soy nuts or soy nuts. So it's not fortified at all. But I guess there's just normal calcium in it. Yeah.
So remember the tofu that we talk about, it comes from having the calcium added in terms of how it's prepared. So if you're just drinking plain soy milk, you could consider getting the fortified soy milk if you're trying to boost your calcium level. But a lot of the unfortified plant-based milks, like almond or even oat, if they don't have calcium added, they're not good sources of calcium.
Okay.
No, and soy does have more calcium naturally than the almond or cashew milk would have, but it's still not very high. It's really quite low. Yeah.
Okay. And then what are your guys' views? So both of you practice veganism, is that correct? Okay.
Yes.
I think maybe you could just differentiate for the audience the difference between a vegan diet and a vegetarian diet, and then maybe your viewpoints on different oils.
Okay, maybe I'll take the vegan question, and Brenda, or we can both sort of chime in for both. So when I think of a plant-based diet, for me, it signifies more of a health indication because you're trying to sort of maintain and preserve health. I also think plant-based can feel a little bit more inclusive because it's very easy to say, I'm a plant-based eater because I like to eat lots of whole plant foods. Veganism really comes from an ethical position, and it's the idea of minimizing harm and as much as is possible and practical. And I think Brenda and I both consider ourselves plant-based eaters, and we both would consider ourselves people who follow a vegan diet. The most important thing I think is when you're considering these labels is if the label seems like, excuse me, it supports your effort, it makes it feel like you have a sense of community and belonging, then I think it's great to sort of embrace those labels. I embrace both those labels because they both feel very true and genuine. But if those labels get in the way of you making progress, then don't worry about it too much. Because some people say, well, I'm not going to call myself vegan because that means a certain thing that I don't feel comfortable calling myself. So in the book, we sort of outline very much in detail the variety of plant-based diets, from vegan to semi-vegetarian to pescatarian to lacto-vegetarian. Veganism is just basically a complete elimination of animal foods. And oftentimes people who follow a vegan diet will also aim to make those choices in non-dietary ways. So in terms of clothing or shoes or, other items as well.
Gotcha.
And can I add, Reshma came from a very ethical perspective when she was young, and I think it's so interesting. Tell them.
Yes, it's interesting because I think a lot of people sort of grew up on meat and potatoes, and they had no idea what vegetarian or vegan food could look like, and it was the exact opposite for me. I grew up in a Jain household. So for those of you who don't know, it's a religious philosophy that practices extreme nonviolence. And we grew up eating vegetarian food all the time. But somehow I left that way of eating and started, especially when I was away from home, ate all kinds of things, chicken and fish and all the things that, omnivorous people eat. And I came back to plant-based eating because I was looking for a healthy way of feeding my family. And then I was like, oh, I remember that thing from growing up that my parents had instilled in me. And so it's kind of come back full circle. I think in the beginning, I would have been reluctant to call myself vegan. And now it's something that I'm very proud to say about myself.
So do you all not use any cooking oils?
So I think Brenda and I have not different philosophies, but different practices in our household. In the book, we sort of emphasize that, especially with kids, you don't want to have an overly restrictive diet. In our household, we use oils in cooking in a very moderate way. For my kids, if I use a little bit of olive oil on a tray of broccoli and I roast it, it's delicious and they love it. And so we use small amounts of oil in our cooking. And I don't worry too much about it because we're eating a lot of healthy whole plant foods. So I think it's fine to use good quality oils in your cooking, especially if it's going to enhance the flavor of the food that you're preparing. And especially for Indian cooking, we use oils a lot of times to temper spices. It really brings out the flavor. So I don't have a problem, especially for kids, using small amounts of oil to enhance the flavor and the enjoyment of food.
You also need the fat from the oil to transport the fat soluble vitamins.
Yeah, and you can certainly get, plants or fats from whole plant foods. So things like avocados and nuts and seeds, including those in your salads and things, will give you some of the fat that you need to absorb those fat soluble vitamins.
Yeah, and so my position is really very similar. I think that oils can be used in a healthy diet. I think that when you would want to reduce or remove them is when you're fighting a chronic disease, you're very overweight, and you're wanting to minimize calories that have no nutritional value. And so oils don't come with a lot of nutrients, and they have 120 calories per tablespoon. And so when all you can eat is 1,600 calories, you want every one of those calories to be putting the fire out that's in your body. And so you really want to be minimizing the highly processed foods like sugars and oils and things like that. So generally, I would limit them more in that situation. And if you are choosing oils, I would try to choose an oil that is really high quality, like an extra virgin olive oil or a fresh, a good avocado oil or something like that. And generally a mono unsaturated oil as opposed to an omega-6 rich oil, as I mentioned.
So just to clarify that for the audience, when you eat something that's a fat, that has fat in it, often it has a combination of numerous types of fat. So there might be a chain of omega-3 fats. It might have a chain of omega-6 fats. So no particular food is 100% one type of fat. So just to clarify some of the nomenclature
yeah. So when we say a mono-rich oil, so like olive oil, for example, most of the fat is mono, probably about 12% is saturated, and a small percentage is polyunsaturated. So all foods contain all of these three main categories: the poly, mono, and saturated fats, but in varying amounts. And so the ones that we sort of identify as being more mono-rich are avocado and olive, for example.
Great.
Nuts tend to be mono, seeds tend to be poly in their makeup. And so the exception, of course, is walnuts are more poly, but all the other nuts are more mono, unsaturated.
Great. Okay, why don't we plan to end here? So thank you so much, Reshma. Thank you so much, Brenda. Totally amazing conversation with you, learning so much from you guys. Go out and buy their book or pre-order the book, Nourish, the Definitive Plant-Based Nutrition Guide for Families. I will have links on my website. I will have links through the email that I send you guys as soon as I have the video up and running, and you can subscribe to receive that email through my website, soulfoodsalon.com. Feel free to make a donation again to Off Their Plate and follow along on their journey through Brenda's evolving social media journey and Reshma's social media journey. They're at Reshma Shah, right, MD?
Just Reshma Shah.
Reshma Shah, and Brenda is at Brenda Davis, RD, and I'm at Soul Food Salon. And we all post really delicious recipes and inspiration. So follow along on all of our journeys, and hopefully we'll educate you and get inspired by you, and you can inspire us as well.
Thanks so much, Jeannie, for having us.
Yes, thank you. It was really nice to be here.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, bye everybody. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.